Gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers,
to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, hence are not for our discussion or debate.
Nor is it for us here to meet, representing as we do a majority of the peoples of the earth in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred.
But rather, it is for us, both victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity, which alone befits the sacred purposes we are about to serve.
Committing all of our peoples unreservedly to faithful compliance with the undertakings they are here formally to assume.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind,
that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
A world founded upon faith and understanding.
A world dedicated to the dignity of man.
And the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you.
As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it, my firm purpose in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance.
While taking all necessary dispositions to ensure the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with.
And now invite representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government.
And the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Mr. Shigemitsu comes to the surrender table. General Yoshijiro Umetsu of the Imperial General Staff signs for the Japanese Army. General MacArthur signs as Supreme Allied Commander. For the forces of the United States itself, Admiral Chester Nimitz signs. General Su Young Chan, Chief of Military Operations for the Chinese National Council, signs for China. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, Commander of the British Pacific Fleet for the United Kingdom. Lieutenant General Kumza Nikolaevich Derevyanko for Soviet Russia. General Sir Thomas Blamey for Australia. Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave for Canada. General Jacques Leclerc, Hero of Africa and Paris for France. Admiral C.E.L. Helfrich for the Netherlands. Air Vice Marshal L.M. Issett for New Zealand.
Let us pray that peace now be restored to the world.
And that God will preserve it always.
Please proceed.
On behalf of the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, welcome to the program. You just saw a compilation of a speech that General Douglas MacArthur gave aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. Millions of people around the world listened to a radio broadcast of that speech. That global audience in 1945 was not unaccustomed to sacrifice or to hardship. The war years had been years of uncertainty. Family and friends had endured long separations, and normal everyday life had been disrupted. Then there was loss, the loss of property, the loss of communities, the loss of cultural objects, and most importantly, the loss of millions of human lives. As 1944 turned into 1945, victory was in sight for the Allies, but more sacrifice was required. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, we're going to look back on that final phase of the war. The cost was high, but there could be absolutely no substitute for victory over the Axis powers. Thank you to Ian Toll for agreeing to be a part of this commemorative event, and thank you to the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring it. Please visit the MacArthur Memorial's website for more information about the museum and the foundation. And please join me now in welcoming John Pentangelo, Director of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, a longtime partner of the MacArthur Memorial and our co-hosts for this event.
Hello, my name is John Pentangelo, Director of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. Located in Norfolk, Virginia, we're one of 10 official Department of the Navy museums administered by the Naval History and Heritage Command. Currently closed to the public in response to the coronavirus, we hope that you'll visit the museum to see our latest exhibit, The 10,000-Day War at Sea, the U.S. Navy in Vietnam, when we reopen in the near future. For more information, please check our website at hrnm.navy.mil. We're proud to partner with the MacArthur Memorial, who brings you this webinar commemorating the formal surrender of Japan to the Allies, ending World War II. 75 years ago, General Douglas MacArthur, recently appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, accepted the surrender aboard the USS Missouri, alongside Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. But the road to that historic moment in Tokyo Bay was a long one, and it is fitting that our speaker, Ian Toll, has completed the final installment of his Pacific War trilogy, Twilight of the Gods, War in the Western Pacific, 1944 to 1945. Ian Toll is a writer and an independent scholar. In addition to his recently published book, he is the author of 3 highly regarded works of American military history: 6 Frigates, about the founding of the United States Navy, and Pacific Crucible and the Conquering Tide, the first 2 volumes in the Pacific War trilogy. The award-winning author has been published in newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Boston Globe. His most recent book has been called an epic masterpiece of military history. Twilight of the Gods is a riveting account of the harrowing final year of the war in the Pacific, when General Douglas MacArthur made good his promise to return to the Philippines. When the United States Navy fought the largest naval battle in history. When the kamikazes attacked American fleets. When the Japanese fought to the last man on one island after another. When B-29 bombers burned Japanese cities, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were vaporized in atomic blasts. Here to speak on these subjects in more detail, please welcome Ian Toll.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I regret that we can't be together in person, and I look forward to the opportunity to be able to come down to Norfolk again when we get this pandemic behind us. But it's appropriate that we're launching this new book, Twilight of the Gods, the 3rd volume of my Pacific War trilogy, with the MacArthur Memorial and the Douglas MacArthur Foundation, as well as the Hampton Roads Museum. You know, historians and biographers have been hard on Douglas MacArthur in recent years and decades, and I have continued in that tradition very much with this trilogy. I have been critical of MacArthur on many counts, on various specific command failures, but also on certain patterns of behavior and frankly on certain unbecoming character traits, a certain deviousness, a tendency to be insubordinate with both military and civilian leaders in Washington. And let's face it, a certain vanity, egoism, verging even upon narcissism. The indictments against MacArthur are long and damning. And yet, even the critics tend to applaud Douglas MacArthur's performance in the years between 1945 and 1950, when he served as a latter-day shogun as the supreme commander of Allied powers in post-war Japan. And that began 75 years ago today at the surrender of the Japanese Empire aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And let me just set the scene for a moment. It was a cool and cloudy day. The battleship Missouri was anchored about 4 miles off of the Yokosuka Naval Base, the largest and most important naval base in Japan. The fleet, hundreds of warships of many different sizes, were anchored around the Missouri. This was the Third Fleet, the main striking force of the US Navy. The fleet was on hair-trigger alert on that day with the guns trained ashore. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito had agreed to surrender 18 days earlier, but no one was sure the peace would stick. And from the fleet, a sailor could climb to the masthead of the Missouri and peer through binoculars to take in scenes of devastation along the shore of Tokyo Bay. At the Yokosuka Naval Base, there were the wrecks of several Japanese warships that had been hit by American carrier planes. Submarines were capsized and half awash along the beach. Debris of various kinds were afloat in the bay and actually presented a navigational hazard to American launches and ships that were moving around. In the bay, the battleship Nagato, which had been flagship of the mighty Japanese fleet at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, was visibly smashed and blackened by fires. Inland toward Tokyo, a witness would just take in scenes of devastation, fields of ash and debris, the results of sustained incendiary bombing raids. And no one knew what to expect of the coming occupation. The Marines had gone ashore at Yokosuka 4 days earlier, found it mostly deserted. The 11th Airborne Division had begun airlifting into Atsugi Air Base, west of Tokyo. MacArthur had flown into Atsugi 3 days earlier. And Japanese civilians had generally greeted the arriving American troops with unexpected friendliness, but many Americans found this to be weird and unnerving. The wartime hatreds were dying hard. POW camps were being liberated all around Tokyo, and the emaciated condition of the prisoners enraged the Americans. And although the occupation had started, and although the emperor had agreed to surrender, the Japanese army was still largely in arms. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were in Tokyo, still under arms, and no Allied troops had yet entered Tokyo. The Japanese, on their part, were still under the spell of wartime propaganda. They expected to be treated as slaves by the occupying army. Less educated Japanese and children even wondered whether the Americans were even human. There were folk tales that had been told, reinforced by propaganda in many cases, that the Americans were ogres or demons. And it was assumed by the Japanese that they would be required to feed the occupying army. That was just as the Japanese armies in China and elsewhere had requisitioned food. And since Japan was already going hungry, indeed verging on famine, it seemed that mass starvation was going to be inevitable. The fears of the Japanese had been reinforced by no less a figure than Admiral Bill Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, and the Missouri was his flagship, who had publicly boasted that his forces would sack and pillage Tokyo, who had made many loose remarks referring to the eventual occupation of Japan that would occur after the war. His famous slogan had been "Kill more Japs," and his bloody-minded tirades had been quoted widely in Japanese newspapers. On that morning, as General MacArthur came aboard the Missouri about 9:15 in the morning, he went back to Halsey's private wardroom and had a moment there with Admiral Halsey and Admiral Nimitz, chief of the Pacific Fleet. And there was a fine handcrafted leather saddle on display in Halsey's private wardroom. Halsey had publicly declared that he intended to seize the emperor's famous white horse as a trophy of war, and the saddle had been sent to him by admirers in the United States. So this was the scene on that morning, and really it could have gone either way. If Halsey had been presiding over that surrender ceremony rather than MacArthur, I think it's clear that it would have taken a very different tone. And as the Japanese surrender delegation came aboard right at 9, 11 civilians and military officers, led by General Umezu of the Imperial General Staff and Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, they arranged themselves on the galley deck under the hard stares of many hundreds of American sailors, of the American and Allied admirals and generals who stood on ranks. And there was a green baize covered table on which 2 copies of the instrument of surrender rested. And promptly at 9, MacArthur, Nimitz, and Halsey emerged from Halsey's wardroom. And MacArthur stepped up to the microphone. And he struck a tone of great dignity. It was a dignified address that he gave. And importantly, he conveyed very clearly to the Japanese that the war was now over and that the period of rebuilding had begun. After the Japanese had signed and the Allies had signed, there was a massive overflight of American B-29s and carrier planes, underlining the absolute power of the conqueror, and leaving the clear message that the Japanese empire now lay prostrate and subjugated. But while returning to Tokyo, the Japanese delegates listened to MacArthur's radio broadcast to the American people. And this address, 766 words, is, in my view, a forgotten classic of American oratory, a truly great speech. Today, the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won. MacArthur said that technology had made war too terrible to contemplate, and that if nations did not find peaceful means to resolve their disputes, Armageddon will be at our door. He called for a spiritual recrudescence. It must be of the spirit if we are to save the flesh. He said that Japan would be rebuilt on democratic foundations, its people liberated from the condition of slavery. The Japanese people would be allowed to return to prosperity, and their economy would recover by building vertically rather than horizontally, that is, at home rather than through foreign conquests. And one of the Japanese, Toshikazu Kaze, and Eida Shigemitsu, later said that he was thunderstruck by this speech. MacArthur could have struck an arrogant pose. He could have gone out of his way to humiliate the Japanese. Instead, he pledged to help the defeated nation lift itself from its present deplorable state into a position of dignity. And later that afternoon, in a private audience with the Emperor, Foreign Minister Shigemitsu remarked that he doubted that the Japanese, if they had been victorious, would have been willing to embrace the vanquished with a similar magnanimity, and the Emperor Hirohito's side and nodded in agreement. In the days and weeks after this ceremony, US and Allied forces poured into the defeated nation, and in many outlying areas, there was little more than a token occupation force. And the Japanese army, again, still in arms in many parts of the country, could have easily overrun these occupation forces if they had chosen to do so. A report that was produced by MacArthur's headquarters later said that the occupation had been a great, though calculated, military gamble. The gamble had been that the emperor's will and authority would cast a psychological spell over the Japanese people, and especially over the Army and Navy. That gamble paid off in spectacular fashion, almost unbelievably, across the length and breadth of this populous nation of Japan. Not a single shot was fired at Allied occupation troops as they entered. The shift from war to peace was just jarring in its suddenness, its totality. A few weeks earlier, the Japanese people had been preparing to meet the invaders with bamboo spears and kitchen knives, and now they bowed and they grinned and they welcomed the newcomers as honored guests. The U.S. Army Sergeant Richard Leonard went ashore at Wakayama, making an assault landing from Higgins boats in full combat gear, and was greeted by Japanese civilians with warm smiles. Vendors were offering trinkets and souvenirs. And during the war, Leonard, like many American servicemen, had hated the Japanese from the bottom of his heart. But now he found that feeling dissolving like a half-remembered dream. And I'd like to read briefly from a letter that he wrote to his fiancée shortly after arriving in Japan. I'm pretty skeptical by nature, but who am I supposed to hate? Can I hate the boy who ran alongside my train window for 50 yards to pay me for a pack of cigarettes that I had sold him just before the train left the station? Can I hate the old man who took us to his home for dinner and made us accept his family heirlooms for souvenirs? Can I hate the kids that run up and throw their arms around me in the street, or a Jap truck driver who went miles out of his way to drive me home one night? Or the little girl about 4 years old who ran up to me and gave me her one and only doll for a present? My answer is that I can't. MacArthur's harshest critics tend to applaud his performance during this period as Supreme Commander in post-war Japan. Retaining Hirohito as a constitutional monarch, he made the emperor a vital ally. He oversaw the drafting of a democratic constitution, guaranteeing basic rights to all citizens, including women. He introduced sweeping social, legal, and economic reforms that benefited Japanese workers and small farmers. The Japanese came to revere MacArthur as a benevolent liberator who had the nation's best interests at heart. And more than any other Allied commander, MacArthur understood instinctively, intuitively, that the Pacific War was a contest of ideas as well as arms. Simply winning the war was not enough. Japan's imperialist ideology had to be discredited and replaced with something better. And so when the moment came for MacArthur to speak for the victorious Allies, he exceeded his mandate by speaking for all nations, including the defeated. Halsey would never ride the emperor's white horse. The Japanese people would not starve. And Japanese democracy, which turns 75 years old today, is MacArthur's greatest legacy. In 2006, I set out to write a single-volume history of the Pacific War. And in retrospect, it's remarkable to me that I ever thought that this could be done. After working for 2 years, I had about 800 pages, and I had only gone through the Battle of Midway, which is just 6 months into a 44-month war. Fortunately, my editor and my publisher, W.W. Norton, quickly proposed that we simply turn this one-volume history into a trilogy. And so for the past 14 years, that's what I've been doing, producing 3 long books. I have missed a number of deadlines along the way, and I learned the hard way that writing a history of this scope takes a great deal more time and effort than I had anticipated. Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, once said that he loved deadlines. He loved the whooshing sound they make as they go by, and I can very much relate to that point of view. I believe I can claim that this trilogy is the first history of the entire Pacific War to be published in at least 25 years. And it's the first multi-volume chronicle of the Naval War since Samuel Eliot Morrison's 15-volume series, which appeared in the late 1940s and 1950s. The first volume, Pacific Crucible, published in 2011, covered the initial 6 months of the war, from Japan's surprise raid on Pearl Harbor to the devastating American counterpunch at the Battle of Midway. Volume 2, The Conquering Tide, published in 2015, told the story of the middle 2 years of the war, from mid-1942 through mid-1944, and the Allied counteroffensives in the South and Central Pacific. This volume, Twilight of the Gods, is the third and last, picking up after the Marianas Campaign and covering the last year of the war through the Japanese surrender. The last year of the Pacific War was one of the most apocalyptic and terrible periods of war in all of human history. It had become clear to all concerned, including the Americans, the British, the Allies, and Japan, that Japan had lost this war. But there was a difference between defeat and surrender, between acknowledging that they were likely to lose their overseas conquests and simply allowing what was to their eyes a barbarian army to come on the sacred soil of Japan. And so this last year of the war was really fought over the principle of unconditional surrender, whether or not the Americans and the Allies could enforce this doctrine and whether or not the Japanese would accept it. The savagery and desperation of successive naval and island battles, island fights drawing closer to Japan over time, Peleliu, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The Japanese fought with total commitment, total savagery, and to the last man. The US Navy won the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. MacArthur made good his pledge to return to the Philippines. Waves of kamikazes attacked the Allied fleets. The Japanese fought to the last man on one island after another. B-29 bombers burned down Japanese cities, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were vaporized in atomic blasts. If the Pacific War had been a game of chess played between grandmasters, there would have been no endgame. Neither player would have felt the need to play to the end when the result was plainly foreseeable. But this was war, not a board game. And Japan insisted upon fighting to the bitter end, even long after it had been clear that the war was lost. In that last year of the war, 1.5 million Japanese servicemen and civilians were to give their lives, like so many pawns, before the checkmate in August 1945. 1.5 million deaths represented about almost half of all of the Japanese killed in the wars of Asia and the Pacific from 1937 to 1945. And nearly half of those Japanese killed in the last year of the war were civilians, most of whom were killed at home in the firebombing raids or the atomic bombs. Even in this final year of the war, however, Japanese military forces showed great valor and audacity with occasional flashes of brilliance. The Japanese army largely abandoned the costly practice that had been so common earlier in the war of launching massed bayonet charges against disciplined, well-armed, entrenched Allied troops. And on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, especially, the Japanese army began to reveal its proficiency in the use of subterranean or honeycomb defensive fortifications, largely vitiating US advantages in artillery and air power. And in several of these island fights of the last year of the war, the Japanese forces were able to inflict a casualty ratio on the American and Allied forces of approximately 1-to-1. That is, one American casualty, including killed and wounded, for each Japanese casualty, of whom the overwhelming majority were killed, inevitably given the customary Japanese refusal to surrender. The kamikazes were a singularly Japanese phenomenon. They arose in a unique cultural context, but in tactical terms, the suicide plane was a stroke of brilliance. It was like a weapon from the future. It was, in effect, a guided missile, a missile guided by a pilot rather than by a computer. A decade ago, as I began this long work of assembling the research for a multi-volume history of the Pacific War, I had to overcome some of my own doubts. Like any other aspect of the Second World War, the Pacific War has been thoroughly mined. Thousands of books, of course, have been published. Every aspect of the conflict has been addressed by historians. But as I did the work, I gained confidence in the justice of my cause. I think that as large as the World War II literature is, it is strikingly lopsided. Certain aspects of this conflict have been worked over to the point of exhaustion. Others have been surprisingly neglected. I think particularly in the realm of the highest echelon of strategic decision-making, there has never been an across-the-board account of the decisions of the Allied High Command with regard to the Pacific. And there has been a persistent tendency to neglect, particularly in that realm of the highest reaches of the command decision-making, to neglect the Pacific in favor of the European theater. World War II was a single large global war, it is true, but it was really also two separate wars that happened to occur at the same time, in which the Allies were on one side of both conflicts, and yet the Axis powers were really allies only in name. The Pacific was a separate conflict. It was a very different conflict. And to understand the decisions, particularly taken at the highest level, one really needs to focus on the Pacific. And knowing what was happening in Europe really doesn't provide much of a basis, much of a grounding, much of a fundamental knowledge base to begin to understand what happened in the Pacific War. Of course, as time goes by, the literature matures, the field becomes deeply enriched, new archives are opened, new oral histories are recorded, new memoirs are published, new and old Japanese sources are translated. Talented writers and scholars on both sides of the Pacific weigh in, they shed lights on various aspects of the conflict. But in general, I think you can say, axiomatic of all military history, there is a stay in your lane mentality, which I think sometimes inhibits well-integrated narratives drawing upon many different adjacent fields, not just military history, not just the realm of high strategy, not just operations on the ground, in the foxholes, on the decks of the ships, in the cockpits, but well-integrated narratives that really shift between different perspectives, constantly moving from one perspective to another, the way you would move around a complex three-dimensional object, constantly looking at it from new perspectives. And the merger of the strategic considerations with the realm of politics, foreign policy, the way statesmen tried to look past the war to the post-war period and began making decisions looking toward the construction of a stable, peaceful post-war order. These are considerations that took place in the halls of power in Washington, in London, in Tokyo. The great questions of strategy and diplomacy. In Tokyo, the problem of how to break a deadlock between the peace party and the hardline extremist fight-on faction within the upper reaches of the Japanese army. Fundamental strategies of questions of grand strategy in the Pacific. Would MacArthur be given the green light to liberate all of the Philippines, including Luzon, the main northern island? Would Ernest King, the leader of the US Navy, win his case to seize Formosa? Would the Americans and the Allies land on the coast of mainland China? If so, would that lead to a wider direct involvement of US forces in the Sino-Japanese War? What was to be the endgame against Japan? Could the nation be persuaded to accept terms of surrender prior to a bloody invasion? And what role might Hirohito, the emperor, play in the war's final act? These were all immensely important questions that were debated at the highest reaches of our government. And in every case, purely military considerations of strategy were blended with these larger issues of statecraft. In the last stages of the war, major events were compressed into a very, very short chronology. The atomic bombs, the sudden Russian declaration of war on Japan on August 9th, leading to a surprisingly early and mercifully bloodless surrender that culminated 75 years ago today with that historic ceremony on the battleship Missouri. I want to conclude just with one last thought. Military history has, to a surprising degree, really been left to non-academic historians in recent years. There are some significant and important exceptions to that. But by and large, the study of war and of military operations has occurred outside of the academy rather than in universities and in academia. And I think that this neglect of the study of war has been a significant oversight. War is a force that has shaped our history, all of history. But more importantly, war, like any other crisis, is a test. It's a test of nations, of systems, of governments, of people, of individuals. When you place something under stress, you find out essential things about its nature. Near the Golden Gate Bridge, where in San Francisco, where I lived for many years, there is a bent girder. This is a large steel girder like those that are used in the construction of the bridge. And this girder, which is a kind of a public exhibit, is the result of a test that was done at Berkeley, at the Berkeley School of Engineering, to determine how well the bridge would stand up to a really large earthquake. And in a sense, war does to a society what those Berkeley engineers did to that girder. It's like an earthquake. It shakes the foundations of the house, and despite the devastation that it causes, it gives you information about how strong the foundation is. You learn something about yourself, about your community, about your country that you could not learn in peacetime. How a nation conducts itself in an emergency reveals essential information about it that you might say the same thing about individuals as well. War is always tragic. It always leaves devastation and sorrow in its wake, but it has always been with us. The Second World War was a necessary war. The US and its allies got rid of German fascism and Japanese ultranationalist imperialism, which had left a trail of misery across Europe and Asia. And in the course of that war, at the outset, there were reasons to think that democracy was not equipped to deal with the war. In the end, our system of government proved the stronger. And the Second World War made the United States a stronger power than it had been, indeed, the strongest power in the world. So a last word on what this history might teach us now as we face the COVID-19 pandemic, the greatest challenge we have faced since World War II against the invisible enemy. Of course, the differences are fairly stark. In World War II, we were up against the Axis nations. Now we're up against an invisible enemy, the virus that attacks all people regardless of politics or nationhood. In World War II, we were called upon to get up and get out of our homes, either to work or to fight, whereas the current pandemic calls upon all of us to stay home, to distance ourselves from others, to hunker down, and to be patient. In World War II, young men died. Today, it's the older and the sicker people who are most vulnerable. In the Second World War, the economy roared. Today, our economy is shut down. But there are important parallels as well. In both cases, the scientific and technical expertise of our nation will eventually provide the way out of this crisis. And we are called upon to work together to pool our resources to help each other to overcome this crisis together. The power of the state over the individual is necessarily increased, which involves a loss of freedom. It's a stress on our system in which freedom and individual rights are so essential. And yet it is, again, like a test that will show us what we're made of as individuals and as a society. I choose to be optimistic. I believe that this crisis will, in the end, make us stronger. Thank you very much.
Mr. Toll, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you being here for the question and answer performance, and thanks for your presentation. It was really great.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Our first question is, President Roosevelt helped General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz settle the decision to capture the Philippines instead of Formosa. Please discuss the proposed Formosa operation in more detail, such as Japanese air and naval strength and land defenses. What would have happened if this operation had been chosen instead of the Philippines?
Well, the operation to invade Formosa, Operation Causeway, would have been by far the largest invasion in the Pacific. And in fact, it may even have exceeded, in some respects, the effort that was needed to invade Normandy in the D-Day invasions of June 1944. The proposal had really come out of the internal Joint Chiefs of Staff Planning Organization. So the centralized military planning organization in Washington had favored this line of attack directly across the Central Pacific through Formosa, the island today called Taiwan, and then potentially involving troop landings on the coast of China. And so this idea that the Washington planners had was there has to be a role for China in the final stage of this campaign. It's partly we wanted to draw upon the manpower, the almost seemingly bottomless manpower of China as a source of infantry to destroy the Japanese armies in Asia and, if necessary, to invade Japan. But the more the commanders in the Pacific studied this proposed operation, Operation Causeway, the less they liked it. And the estimates for the number of troops that would be needed to invade Formosa continually increased. And so ultimately, and I think that this is an important point which is often lost in many of the histories, the reason MacArthur won that argument, the reason MacArthur won his case to liberate all of the Philippines, including the main northern island of Luzon, was not so much that he made the strong political case to Roosevelt that there was an obligation. That was a factor, but I don't think that was the most important factor. The most important factor was that the only real alternative to MacArthur's idea of liberating all of the Philippines was this invasion of Formosa. And as they studied it, they meaning really the Navy in the Pacific particularly, and also the Army in the Pacific, the more they studied this operation, the less they liked it, and they ultimately came to the conclusion that they would need massive troop reinforcements from Europe in order to do it. So the alternative to MacArthur's idea really was sort of revealed as not feasible, as impractical. And so MacArthur would have won that argument regardless of the political aspects of this, the idea that there was an obligation to the Philippines. And even if MacArthur had not had the kind of unique clout, fame, access to the media, all of those aspects, even if you'd had a low-key Army commander in his place, I think that we would have done the exact same thing. We would have gone to Luzon, we would have bypassed Formosa, and we would have gone to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, because that was the sequence of operations that made the most sense from a purely military standpoint.
Right. Thank you very much. A next question. Why wasn't Spruance given a 5th star?
Well, when Congress enacted the legislation to award the 5-star rank, they created essentially eight ranks. So 8 officers were going to get the 5 stars. The Army and the Navy bargained, and typically they made the Sullivan-like decision to say, we'll make 4 generals and 4 admirals we'll raise to 5-star rank. It was clear that 3 of those admirals were going to be Leahy, King, and Nimitz. And then the question really became who got the 4th 5-star billet for the Navy. I think Halsey got it primarily because he had a higher profile than Spruance.
Right.
He was much better known. He was very popular with the American people. So I think that issue of fame and celebrity again came into that decision. Almost immediately, even at the time, it was seen that Spruance was being denied something that he had earned. If Halsey had earned a 5th star, certainly Spruance had as well. But Congress would have had to then act again to create another 5-star billet, and that simply didn't happen. There have been movements to try to give Spruance a 5-star, a 5th star, even though he passed away decades ago. That may happen someday, but that was the reason.
Thank you. Excellent answer. We have a question. Can you expand on your previous public comments regarding research into General Richardson's diaries?
Yeah, General Robert C. Richardson was the commanding general of Army forces in Nimitz's theater, so in the northern part of the Pacific, with his headquarters in Hawaii. He was the Army's top man in Nimitz's theater. He kept a very detailed and fascinating diary, which he willed to his descendants to keep private until the year 2015. So 5 years ago, this diary, the family realized that this diary now, according to the general's wishes, should be made available to historians. I was fortunate enough to be the person that the family approached. And the diary, which is now available, it's at the Hoover Archives at Stanford University in California, it's one of these things that's just sort of a day-by-day account of the various struggles between the Army and the Navy. It has lots of fascinating, sort of colorful observations about Chester Nimitz in particular. It's critical of Nimitz. It's a different perspective. We're not accustomed to Chester Nimitz being criticized. In this diary, he's portrayed as being much more of a political player. I don't necessarily think that's fair, but it is interesting. Yes. MacArthur stayed with Richardson. They were old friends. When he traveled to Hawaii in July 1944 to meet with FDR and Nimitz in their Hawaii Strategy Conference, in which they really decided many of the major issues that we've been talking about. And each night after the conference sessions, MacArthur debriefed Richardson, and Richardson then recorded what MacArthur said. So it really is a very important news source.
Yes.
And I could go on probably for 20 more minutes. I won't do that, but I do spell it out in some detail in this book.
Excellent. Thank you. How would you compare your trilogy to the upcoming trilogy of Richard Frank, especially his approach of making it Asia-Pacific War to emphasize the role of China and the conflict on the mainland Asia?
Yeah, well, Richard B. Frank, first of all, is one of the best historians in this field. He is not an academic historian like me. He was a lawyer. He's also a Vietnam veteran who just took an interest in this subject and has really established himself as a leading authority in this field. And I have nothing but the greatest respect for him. He has published the first of a projected trilogy about what he calls the Asia-Pacific War. And it does take a broader kind of approach to really looking at the conflicts on the Asian mainland, as well as in the Pacific. It's more of a sort of a top-down history, in some ways more of a traditional history. The narrative architecture of his approach is very different. I think it's complementary, and I think that if you're really interested in the subject, I commend all of Richard Frank's books, including the first of this projected trilogy. He's a terrific researcher and someone who's going to make a really important contribution.
Well, we commend all of yours as well, sir. Did MacArthur, this is more about the speech on the Missouri, did MacArthur get any guidance or direction from Washington or what to include or not to include in the speech?
No, there's certainly nothing in the historical record to indicate that he received any guidance at all. And so I believe that MacArthur wrote those speeches himself.
Yes.
It's possible that he may have had some help from members of his staff. Bonner Fellers, for example, may have helped him. He was sort of a one-man think tank within the MacArthur camp, within the MacArthur headquarters. But I believe that MacArthur actually wrote these speeches. There was the short speech, which in a very moving way, you had all of the different people read at the beginning of the program.
Right.
Then the longer speech that he gave after the Japanese left the ship, this was a radio broadcast to the American people. It was that second speech, which in my remarks earlier, I said was a forgotten classic of American oratory. It's a terrific speech, and I encourage you to look it up and read it. I believe that he wrote those without any guidance at all from Washington, as far as I know. At least there is no evidence that he received any guidance.
We believe the same as well. What was the most unexpected thing that you learned while researching your trilogy?
Well, boy, it's hard to name one thing, but I'll just pick one. The existence of a fairly determined peace faction within the Japanese regime throughout the last year of the war, that was something I didn't understand as well until I really began to dig into the sources on the Japanese wartime regime. There was a determined faction within the ruling group that wanted to end the war by almost any means necessary. Ultimately, they were even willing to go to unconditional surrender. Even before the atomic bombs, they were willing to do that. And they had quite a bit of influence. The army was the most powerful institution in Japan, and yet these other elements of Japanese society, in the Navy, in the bureaucracy, among the aristocracy, among the imperial household, there were these other powerful and influential elements within the Japanese regime that ultimately were able to prevail in their long deadlock against the hardline fight-on faction.
Thank you. In your opinion, why have historians in the university neglected military history? And what might the consequences of this neglect be for college graduates and for society?
Well, I think that we do need to study war. We do need to study our wars and to understand them for the reasons that I gave in my remarks earlier. I think it's fallen out of fashion, broadly speaking, in academia, military history. And, fortunately, there are many of us outside of academia that have stepped into that void and have continued to do this work. Broadly speaking, putting military history and war aside, I think that what students don't learn in school about American history, they've got to learn as they live their lives. And so that's where I think reading is important. I think documentaries are important. I think institutions like the MacArthur Memorial, like the Hampton Roads Museum, museums in general, that are trying to preserve the knowledge of the past, all of that is important. This education is something that our citizens need, and if they're not getting it in school, we hope to provide ways for people to continue to learn and to absorb the lessons of the past as they go through their lives.
Excellent. What is the origin of the title of the third volume?
Well, Twilight of the Gods was Wagner's ring cycle, Götterdämmerung. It is a kind of a final Armageddon, a final reckoning, a sort of a terrible and explosive and dramatic ending. And I can't think of a better term for the end of this war, particularly from the Japanese point of view. The Japanese have a pantheistic religion, so they have this concept of gods, and so I thought that worked well. And of course, the Japanese national symbol is the rising sun, and the metaphor of a setting sun suggests itself. It has suggested itself to many other authors as well. And so Twilight worked well. So I just sort of thought the title just sort of occurred to me as the perfect title. And so that's the reason for that.
Very good. Was there anything new you found in regards to the planning for possible non-nuclear assault on the Japanese home islands had the A-bombs not been used?
Well, the Operation Downfall, which was the invasion of Japan that was planned in two stages. First, Olympic, which was the invasion of Kyushu, the southern island of Japan, to be followed by a really massive invasion involving some 25 divisions of Honshu, the main island. That was Operation Coronet. These operations, which didn't happen, they have received quite a bit of attention from scholars and historians in recent years. So, and to be honest, no, I wouldn't say I found anything that was earth-shaking or different from what we know. I do agree with the consensus, I think you can say, that these would have been awful, absolutely awful events. They would have been, you know, we weren't going to lose 1 million people. I mean, many of the casualty estimates that are thrown around, I think, are not serious, they're not grounded in the history. And yet, whatever the casualties would have been on the American and the Allied side, they would have been high, too high. And for the Japanese people, these would have been absolutely awful events in which you could see certainly hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians being killed. And so it was absolutely necessary to avoid an invasion of Japan. Now, it's my view that if we didn't have the atomic bomb, say if the Manhattan Project had failed, most likely this war would have ended with a Japanese surrender prior to an invasion. It's a counterfactual argument, which means that it's somewhat controversial. And there's no way to absolutely win that argument. All you can do is weigh the evidence. And yet I think that there are good reasons to think that before the scheduled invasion date of November 1st, almost 3 months after the bombing of Hiroshima, the deadlock that we were discussing in the Japanese regime, that would have been resolved. And the emperor would have been able to decree for surrender.
Most interesting. What's your perspective on the role of the atomic bombs versus Soviet intervention in the Japanese decision to surrender?
And so these events happened within such a compressed timetable that I think it's difficult to weigh the relative importance of these events. So just to review, on August 6th, we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, we dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. But also on August 9th, the Soviet Union suddenly declared war on Japan and launched this massive ground assault into Manchuria. And so from the Japanese point of view, the Russian declaration of war was really a shattering blow. It created this immediate military emergency, which is that you had the largest and in many ways the most formidable army in the world, the Red Army in 1945, suddenly turned loose on you. But the Japanese had also hoped, their last hope of a diplomatic exit to the war was to induce Stalin to sort of step in as a mediator. And so they were attempting to have Moscow play this role as a peace mediator. And so that Russian declaration of war destroyed essentially the only alternative plan they had for how to get themselves out of this war, the only alternative to surrender. So the Russian declaration of war was enormously important in forcing the Japanese surrender. The atomic bombs were also important. If the question is asked, which was more important, it's very difficult to say. We had interrogators go in there and talk to the Japanese leaders afterward. There were contradictory answers. Some said the Russian declaration was more important. Some said the atomic bombs. Some said they were both equally important. So what are we left with? I think you have to sort of say they were both really important, and it's a fruitless exercise to try to say which was more important. They were both important. The combination of these events happening within a very short period of time were all very important in forcing the Japanese to surrender.
If war is a stress test, what do you think World War II revealed about American society and military versus Japanese society and military?
I think it revealed that our model of society had much greater latent strength, whereas the Japanese or authoritarian model, I think you can probably say this of fascism as well in Europe, had the ability to organize their societies for aggression, but didn't necessarily have the staying power over a longer period of time in a prolonged war of attrition.
Wow.
In which our model was superior. Now this concept of comparing the relative strength of these models of government is somewhat complicated by the fact that we had our allies in Moscow, a communist regime, another kind of a totalitarian regime, in some ways more similar to fascism than our system of democracy. And yet, I think you can extend this idea into the Cold War, and you see the democratic idea surviving over this long, bloodless struggle with communism. So that's my view. And we can go on for an hour about that, but that's what I've got to say about that for the moment.
We have a few more questions if you're willing.
Of course.
Excellent. National will is an important aspect to endeavors in both war and peace. And by early mid-1945, did American will to fight wane, requiring senior leaders to increase their efforts to persuade the American people and government leaders?
I don't think that there's a lot of evidence that there was a sort of a decline in the determination to see this thing through. There was great war weariness, for sure. And in fact, American leaders, as they were debating the different ways in which we might force the Japanese to surrender, this was something that they were very concerned about. Will the American people essentially start to demand some sort of a way of ending the war in the Pacific rather than prolonging it endlessly? This was one of the reasons that many of our leaders were reluctant to get into any sort of a dialogue with the Japanese, with the concern that if the American people learned that talks had opened, that they then would reject any suggestion that we, after having open diplomatic talks, we then would have to invade. And so this notion of war weariness, both among civilians at home, but also among servicemen overseas, this was something that our leaders, military and civilian leaders, were very, very concerned about. And yet, certainly there was this clear determination to end this war in a way that would end it for good, which really meant unconditional surrender, and in particular, which meant that we were going to have to occupy Japan as we had occupied Germany, that we were going to have to supervise the disarming of the Japanese military, and that we were going to have to be absolutely sure that this regime couldn't again become aggressive and force us to have to go fight this war again. And it was the psychology of, the First World War only 25 years earlier really everyone, Americans, the Allies, understood that this had to be the last time we were going to do this. We didn't want a third world war. And I think that the American people in general understood that principle as well and supported it.
How do you envision academia undertaking the study of war?
Well, as I said, I think, to a remarkable extent, much of the important work, even the more serious scholarship that's been done in the field of military history, has been undertaken by non-professional scholars. There are important exceptions to that. There are the service academies, for example, or the military universities. The question seems somewhat open to me. I think that the study of war, the study of military history is important, and I think it deserves a larger place in academia than it has today.
Do you have an idea of the prevalent opinions among war planners at the time of the Iwo Jima invasion about the expected result strategically? And how prevalent was the idea that it was not necessary?
Well, Iwo Jima, I think many of the island operations in the Pacific War did become controversial after the fact, as people asked the question, did we need to take that island? And so Peleliu is a good example. Tarawa is another good example. Even the Philippines, some say we should have bypassed the Philippines. In general, I believe that most military analysts and historians, and I include myself among them, believe that taking Iwo Jima was necessary. It was, of course, a very costly battle. The Japanese had converted this small island. It's 8 square miles. This is an island that's about 600 miles south of Japan, between the Marianas and Japan. Had converted this 8 square mile island virtually into a fortress with these underground fortifications, this enormous system of tunnels and bunkers, and had reinforced the island to the point where they were really ready to make the Americans pay for every yard of territory that they took, which is why Iwo Jima was a particularly bloody and terrible battle. We did need Iwo Jima. We needed it in particular to support the B-29 campaign, as a alternate landing destination for B-29s returning from bombing raids over Japan. Iwo Jima was almost directly on the direct flight path between the air bases of Guam and Saipan and Tinian and in the Tokyo region. Probably thousands of lives were saved of B-29 airmen because of the fact that we had this base in the last 6 months of the war. The controversy over Iwo Jima, in my view, is whether we should have taken it earlier. And in retrospect, of course, those who are there don't have the luxury of retrospect. In retrospect, we should have seized Iwo Jima almost immediately after taking the Marianas. We probably would have saved many thousands of American lives if we had done that.
Interesting. The European and Pacific Wars were necessarily fought in different ways, given their relative size and geographic differences. Did the race of the enemies also play a part in how they were fought?
The race of the enemies, so I think the questioner is probably referring to this dynamic in Europe where you had the Allies coming from the West and the Soviets coming from the East and trying to sort of seize as much territory as they could. And yes, there was this race dynamic in the last stage of the Pacific as well. It had to do really with the Soviet declaration of war in the last, literally in the last week. August 9th, Stalin suddenly declares war against Japan. The Red Army, which had prepared this invasion, rolls into Manchuria. And at that point, it became clear to the American leaders that we had to end this war quickly just in order to prevent the Soviets from gaining a much larger footprint in Asia. Stalin wanted to divide Japan in the same way that Germany had been divided. He wanted an international coalition to go in and occupy Japan. He wanted Russian troops to occupy part of the country. The part of the country that he looked at and said he wanted was Hokkaido. That's the northern island of Japan.
Right.
Stalin wanted Hokkaido. And if the war had continued for even a month longer, I think there's a very good chance that the Soviets would have taken the island of Hokkaido. We would not have been able to dislodge them without actually fighting them. And then you can easily envision a counterfactual in which Hokkaido becomes analogous to East Germany during the Cold War, becomes a Soviet client state, and the Iron Curtain would be running right down the strait between Honshu and Hokkaido.
Wow.
So, you know, of the many different arguments that we have over the atomic bombs, I think maybe one of the better arguments would be we needed to end the war quickly, and the atomic bombs provided the shock that helped bring that war to a quick ending, preventing the Russian armies from taking more territory, from taking all of Korea. Another counterfactual, Kim Jong-un could be in charge of all of Korea today.
Yes.
If the Pacific War had lasted a month longer. These are absolutely realistic counterfactuals. And so ending that war quickly, there was this race dynamic between Truman and Stalin, and ending the war quickly was important for all of those reasons.
This one's kind of about your style of writing, and the questioner wants to know, how do you go about structuring and organizing your research and writing? How do you know when it's time to stop researching and time to start writing?
Yeah. No, I suspect that the questioner probably has done a little bit of this work because that's very much on point. In general, I think writing doing the kind of narrative that I do with a storytelling kind of sensibility in the way that I try to structure the narrative, it really does require a certain kind of intuitive and iterative process when you're doing the research to try to think in terms of, you know, how do you stack this narrative up in a way that draws the reader in? You know, how do you use the storytelling sort of narrative architecture? And it really does have to start with the research. You can't do the research and then just start with the writing. It's got to be further upstream from that. When to stop researching and start writing, that is a conundrum. And it really comes down to a judgment call. It helps to have the pressure of deadlines. But I'll just say that I've written 4 books, and the amount of research that I have left out of the books really is enormous. And for me, the answer probably is I should stop researching and start writing earlier than I have been.
Given the Imperial Japanese Army's commitment in mainland Asia, what was the Japanese view of the war? Asia was the main show, or the Allied advance in the Pacific?
Well, I think in the beginning, Japanese aggression, going back to their invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s, their idea really had been to seize territory in Asia. This was partly an internal Japanese argument also. The Army had much more of a take territory in Asia kind of orientation. The Navy had more of a feeling of, let's take territory in the South Pacific. And this argument in a complicated way, which, you know, I go into in some detail in the books, really was at the heart of the decision to attack the United States and Great Britain in December 1941. There was a struggle between the Army and the Navy that produced that decision in a very interesting and complicated way. So, you know, early, it was Japanese ambitions to dominate Asia, to expand their footprint in mainland Asia, become the dominant power in China, to control China's riches. After the Pacific War began, it fairly quickly, I would say within a year, Pearl Harbor became clear that the Americans and the Allies, their counteroffensive in the Pacific was an existential threat to Japan. whereas none of their enemies in Asia, so long as the Soviet Union remained neutral, had the ability to potentially threaten Japan itself. And so the orientation, I think, shifted fairly clearly after 1941 in the Japanese view, from Asia being the sort of cynosure of the conflict to the Pacific and the American offensive to being the principal focus.
Can you describe interviews you had with veterans who fought in the Pacific War, and what most impressed you?
Well, I mean, in general, my first book was Six Frigates. This was a history of the founding of the U.S. Navy. It was a history really of the period between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So, you know, of course, you're not talking to anybody who was a witness to any of those events. When I began researching and writing about World War II, the idea that you could actually talk to people who had seen and participated in these events directly was just a tremendous kind of revelation to me. And so I have interviewed hundreds of World War II veterans. I continue to do it today. I would say that these interviews have colored every aspect of this 3-volume narrative from beginning to end. Given the time frame that I was doing this research, really between 2007 and today, the reality is that the World War II veterans that we have had over that period were very young men,
right,
during the Second World War, which means that in general you're talking about lower ranking enlisted men and junior officers. And because I'm very concerned in my research with the command decisions that were made, with the strategic debates, given the time in which I've been working, I really have had to rely to a great degree on oral histories that were reported of the higher ranking officers. So records that were made in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. But as I say, being able to look through the eyes of someone who was there is an immensely powerful kind of tool for any researcher. We're at 75 years today since the surrender of the Japanese and the end of the Second World War. When we get to the 100th anniversary, that living link with history will be cut.
Yes.
There will be no one who will be able to remember these events and talk about them with a direct eyewitness kind of perspective. And so it's precious, really. It's precious that we still have World War II veterans who we can talk to and who can convey these things through their personal accounts. And we're in the sort of the last phase in which that will be true.
Another question is, they were wondering if you could talk a bit more about how China fit into the narrative of the Pacific War, Allied consideration of landing troops on mainland China, Chiang Kai-shek's influence on strategic decision-making, and what you found in the course of your research that you thought was most surprising or interesting about that.
Well, the conflict in China is one that I've touched on really in a glancing fashion. With the kind of storytelling narrative that I've used in these books, you have to have somewhat of a center of gravity. And the center of gravity for me really has been the Pacific, Pacific campaign. Now that said, the war in China is absolutely fascinating. Of course, it was critical. The Japanese army was tied down in China throughout this conflict. And so by the end of the war, when it was clear that the Americans and our allies were closing in on the Japanese home islands, the Japanese army became frantic to try to extract themselves from this conflict in China. But the war in China was an immense war. It was a terrible war. And it was one that has not received nearly as much attention from Western historians until recently. We talked about Richard Frank's work earlier. And anyone who really is interested in understanding better what happened in China and how it interplayed with the larger conflict. Again, I would point you toward Frank's work.
Thank you. MacArthur wanted to use Australian troops to retake Java and reestablish Dutch control over the East Indies. The Joint Chiefs canceled this operation, but why was MacArthur so committed to reestablishing Dutch control?
Well, I think MacArthur in general wanted to clean the Japanese out of that whole region.
Right.
So, he had been authorized to take the island of Leyte and then the island of Luzon. But then without any further authorization, he then took essentially all of the remaining islands of the Philippines.
Yes.
Why did he want to take Java? Well, I think that it probably was, to be quite honest, that MacArthur was in many ways a product of, an earlier time. And he believed that these colonial empires should be returned to those who had controlled them in the past. And I think it was probably as simple as that.
Yeah. To us, it doesn't make sense just because he was so opposed to the British,
Yeah.
Going back in. He was opposed to the French, but yeah, for some reason he goes for the Dutch. We've never understood it either. Given MacArthur's connections to the Philippines, this person finds it surprising how little he did to assist post-war reconstruction there versus his work in Japan. Is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, I think it's a fair criticism. Yeah, I do. There was also the MacArthur's, web of relationships with the Filipino elite really came into this kind of this meddling, this tendency to meddle in Philippine democracy, just as Philippine democracy was getting off the ground. But I think that MacArthur was on the ground in Japan as of August 1945, and that was naturally his focus because that's where he was.
Sure, we agree very much. Do you think there would be any value in having a museum on the atomic bombings and their aftermaths and the issues surrounding their dropping that you touched upon in your recent op-ed piece?
Yeah, I would say, maybe not a museum, but certainly an exhibit. We're now 25 years since the controversial attempt of the National Air and Space Museum to put on just an exhibit essentially dealing with all of these issues in the Enola Gay exhibit. And as you may recall, that became a big public controversy, and ultimately the Smithsonian canceled that exhibit and just put on a bare bones exhibition of the Enola Gay itself. So in 1995, the judgment was that we essentially weren't ready as a country to face up to these difficult issues in a big national exhibit. Now, I think maybe times have changed, and certainly looking forward, say, to the 100th anniversary, 25 years from now, I would like to see the Smithsonian revisit this issue and to put on a big national exhibit. Doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent museum,
right,
but an exhibit that would really tell the entire story of the decision to drop the atomic bombs, of what the alternatives may have been, and to let both the critics and the defenders of the decision have their say in the exhibit, and also to depict the suffering of the Japanese people on the ground. I think it's a shame that the Smithsonian was unable to do that 25 years ago, and I think that they should try to go back and correct that mistake and try to do that exhibit at some point in the future.
Excellent. Last couple of questions. Was the aerial bombing campaign against the Japanese industrial base necessary and effective, considering American submarine warfare was essentially choking off Japanese supplies of imported oil and raw materials?
Yeah, well, the submarine campaign and the strategic bombing campaign were working together, weren't they? They were both attacking the foundations of the Japanese war effort by essentially undermining the Japanese economy. And so if the question is which of them were more important, I think that's an interesting question and a hard one. the destruction of Japan's overseas trade, particularly cutting off all imports of oil from Japan, from the East Indies into Japan, that essentially choked off the Japanese economy and would have caused the entire Japanese war machine to essentially seize up by as early as September 1945. At the same time, the destruction of the Japanese industrial base and the burning down of Japanese cities from the air also made it quite clear to the Japanese, both the people and the leaders of Japan, that they could not continue this war. And so I think it would be difficult to say which of those two was more important. They were both very important in essentially destroying the Japanese ability to continue making war.
Right. And our final question of the night: what's next for Ian Toll after this trilogy?
I'm working on a few different things, but I think there's more to be said about the Second World War. I'm particularly interested about what happened here at home. We call it the home front. That's not a name I particularly like, but I am really interested in the politics that happened in Washington during the Second World War and how we organized ourselves as a society in order to fight total war. And so I think I'll probably be weighing in with a book on that subject in the future.
Excellent. And please tell everyone where they can get your book, Twilight of the Gods.
Well, it's available in bookstores everywhere and online at Amazon, anywhere you buy books.
Great. Ian Toll, it's always a pleasure. We thank you so much. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as much as we did, and we can't thank you enough.
Thank you, Jamin. And I wanted to say also, I wanted to say this while everyone's here. I want to thank you for your assistance to me in researching the MacArthur Memorial archives. You and I actually haven't met, but over email, you were really helpful, and I appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you too. It's always a pleasure, and anything you need in the future, just let us know. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.